Timmery, and we're here for another episode of Data Talks. Today, I'm here with Ravi Parikh, co-founder of Heap. Hey, Ravi.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for coming. So, Ravi, what do you recommend for people who are trying to get buy-in for their data initiatives?
It's a really good question. I think first and foremost, you have to choose a concrete use case that solves a top-level business initiative if you can get buy-in for what you're doing. So I don't think it's enough to just say, we want to become more data-driven, because that is sort of amorphous. It's not clear what that means. It's going to be the sort of thing that's destined for failure unless people are really gung-ho about that idea in general. So instead, pick something narrow, pick something concrete, pick something that solves a specific problem that the business is having, and solve that problem using data. The nice thing about doing that is you're going to get this sort of cumulative advantage effect where if you solve one problem using data, if you have sort of a novel approach to that, people will notice that. People will say, this thing works, and then you'll get more resources and more leeway the next time you want to approach a problem like that. And eventually you can build your way up to sort of that, making the entire company culture more data-driven.
It's kind of like a compounding effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'll give an example. So at Heap, we're an analytics company ourselves. We collect a lot of data, and as a result, we spend a lot of money on server infrastructure every year. It's important for us to make sure that spend doesn't go too high, but historically we actually haven't had a ton of resolution on what causes that spend to spike or go down and things like that. So we have a rough high-level understanding, but we until a few years ago weren't able to tell at a great level of depth what exactly was driving that spend. And for the most part, it didn't actually matter because our gross margins were pretty healthy. We didn't have a situation where the spend was really eating into our margins in a big way. That sort of changed over the last year, actually. So we started to see that spend rise faster than we had anticipated and faster than we would like as a company. So at that point, it became a top-level company initiative to drive down gross margins and drive down the spend on server infrastructure. And so at that point, we decided to say, let's get a lot more data-driven and a lot more in-depth about how we think about our spend. And so we did a project where we understood all the sources of spend, all the different types of machines and things like that we were buying, and what variables influence that spend. And we got a much more nuanced, much more granular understanding of it. We were then able to use that data to make some changes to how our infrastructure was built, essentially, and that drove down spend significantly, and we got back to a pretty healthy margin. And so this is all a way of saying, we didn't get data-driven about gross margins until it mattered. And when it mattered, it was very easy to justify the resources internally to get more data-driven there. And now we are more data-driven about it, so if that problem comes up again, we'll be able to solve it fairly quickly. But I think it would have been the wrong decision to have, in advance, built in a lot of that infrastructure, because that would have taken resources away from something else that was a company problem at the time.
That totally makes sense, and that's such a great example of finding what project to work on and why and when, and that's really great.
I think it's also really important to understand what being data-driven means to the people at your company. The people on the leadership team, the people on the executive team might have really different conceptions of what data-driven means than what you have in your head. And what that might mean is when you sort of pitch your project or launch into what you're trying to do, it may be destined for failure or destined for not getting that buy-in. I'll give an example. So let's say you're trying to do an analytics project within the sales team. You're trying to make the sales team more data-driven, get a better understanding of how sales is performing. It's important to figure out what the sales leader and the sales leadership in general wants to see out of that project. So I've worked with sales leaders where what they want to do with analytics is really use it as a management tool rather than an analysis tool. So they want to make a dashboard and see all the reps and how they're performing against each other, who's closing the most deals, who's closing the most revenue, make sure that's publicly visible on a TV screen, and make sure people understand, who's ranked number one and who's ranked last. And that can be a really effective management tool, the right kind of sales culture. On the other hand, you might be approaching the analytics problem from the perspective of, I want to diagnose our pipeline and figure out where which sources of leads are leading to the best sort of performance in the pipeline. And that's a noble goal as well, but if what your sales leader was expecting to see was something very different, then you might be destined for failure there. Those goals aren't mutually exclusive. You just need to sort of understand what people are looking for from your analytics project.
Right. It totally makes sense that people should be on the same page before they start their data projects.
Right.
So what are the biggest mistakes that people make that prevent them from moving forward with their data initiatives?
For sure. I think there's a few big mistakes that we see people make over and over again. I think number one is just trying to do something too big. So I think we'll talk to companies and they'll say, we're trying to measure the entire customer journey and centralize all that data into one place. And that's an admirable goal.
It totally is.
It's something to build towards. It's
Yeah.
something to get to. But if you're not already far along on that journey, you probably don't have a sense of how big that journey actually is to get to that place where all that customer data is centralized in one place. Like the reality is any sufficiently complex business is going to have touch points with their customers that live in a number of different places. People are interacting with their website, people are interacting with their mobile app, people are coming to the store, people are calling into their call center, people are coming to events, trade shows, booths, whatever it might be. There's hundreds of different ways in which your customers can interact with you. And each one of those ways has a different sort of data challenge, actually collecting data on those interactions, having it tied to that user, not to mention centralizing all that data once you have it. It's fairly difficult to try and centralize all that data in one place at once, and it's not necessary to centralize all that data in one place at once in order to get value out of a data initiative. You can pick one small slice of that. Think about where are the places which are currently fairly measurable, where we currently have good data on what's going on, and build from there, rather than trying to sort of say like, well, we need to do all of this in order to solve any data problems.
That totally makes sense. It's better to have like a small success than like an epic failure.
Definitely.
For sure.
And you can build to that over time. Just because you've chosen a narrow problem today doesn't prevent you from getting to something a lot more generalized in the future. I think another big problem people do is they dive into a problem space where the data is not clean enough to support what they're trying to do. So, for example, let's say you have a sales team and you want to better understand sort of your sales metrics and better understand your sales funnel and optimize that. But if you have a situation where your CRM is inconsistent, it's not clean, you have duplication of accounts, you have reps who aren't entering data consistently, then that data is essentially useless for informing that data initiative. And changing the nature of that data is not just a technological problem; it's a cultural problem. If you have a sales culture where people aren't entering in data properly and things like that, and depending on your company, depending on your organization, you may or may not have the ability to change that. So if you want to take on a data initiative which requires a lot of other people to change the way they do data entry in your CRM, that might be destined for failure from day one.
Yeah.
So choosing a domain where you have a little bit more control over the shape of the data that you're working with is generally a bit wiser.
Is there any tips for, like, let's say you have a data set and it's like not as clean? Are there like general like best practices of like how to like get that data more trustworthy?
Sure. I mean, it totally depends on the data.
Yeah.
I think to go back to the sales example, ultimately sales data is only as good as what people are doing, but there are sort of enrichment tools and stuff out there, things like Clearbit, that can actually automate a lot of the population of that data into it. So instead of relying on your sales reps to tell you how many employees each company has, like use an enrichment tool to get there. So there's sort of like vendors that can help with that. In the world of web data, of course, Heap is something that can help with the automation of data collection over there. So there's a number of, depending on what domain you're in, there's a number of tools and vendors that might exist to sort of like automate some of the stuff that makes data typically become untrustworthy or unclean.
And how do you get an executive sponsor and resources for your data initiatives?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the company culture. There are companies where there's already sort of a lot of top-down buy-in on becoming more data-driven, in which case the question's kind of moot. It's probably pretty easy. But in the event that it's not, that you're sort of at a company where people don't necessarily buy into what your vision is of how data can be deployed at the company, I think it's important to tie those initiatives to things that are important at the company. This isn't to say you should lie about what you're doing or change what you're doing. It's more framing the things you're doing in ways that benefit the things that people care about. So, for example, I've worked with a lot of digital marketing teams, and every digital marketing team is a little bit different, but sometimes they're entirely focused on acquisition to the exclusion of everything else. So they're thinking about, for them, data is a tool to optimize ad spend, to think about attribution, and that stuff's important, but they don't see the value necessarily in measuring the rest of the customer journey, or they think of that as sort of a different department's problem. And if you're sort of embedded into digital marketing and you see value in sort of measuring the rest of that customer journey or measuring the more mid-funnel, bottom-of-funnel customer experience, you may have limited success in sort of getting buy-in or resources around what you're trying to do. If on the other hand, you can sort of show that, like, look, if we make optimizations on our website or in our app that cause people to convert at higher rates, to cause people to be retained at higher rates, to cause more repeat purchases, whatever that might be, those things ultimately mean that the top of funnel spend we're doing is more valuable spend. It means every dollar we're spending has higher ROI than it would have had otherwise. It means we actually can spend more dollars and still get marginal ROI out of that. And ultimately that plays into incentives and the things that team cares about. So framing that data initiative is something that'll help ultimately what they're doing is something that is probably more likely to get executive buy-in than the other way around.
Does it make sense to select like a specific executive and like pitch them this initiative and like show this ROI first, or is it just like a team focused thing, or like how do you recommend going about that?
I think that really depends on the way your company's set up and the culture of it. There's some companies that are a lot more top down. There's some companies that are a lot more egalitarian, and it just depends on what that looks like.